All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We've got a good crowd. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by two of my favorite people in all of technology law academia, Tal Zarsky and Jane Bambauer. I'm a little biased because I have the good fortune to work with these folks. Both have just published voluminous, terrific contributions to the technology law literature. Let me say a little bit about both of them. Tal is a professor of law at the University of Haifa's Faculty of Law. He's published most recently on data breach regulation, and also terrific work on data privacy and online intermediaries, among many other topics. He was a fellow at the Information Society Project at Yale Law, also a fellow at NYU Law, and is somewhat unique in being an expert in like data privacy basically everywhere on the planet. I will at some point find a place where I can stump Tal, but I haven't yet. So we're very fortunate to have him. And Jane Bambauer is with us, professor of law at the University of Arizona. Again, a just terrific scholar in this field. She's done tremendous work on online speech, data privacy, and algorithmic fairness. Again, among many other areas like Tal, there's just not the time to go through all of Jane's contributions. Her work's been published in all of the places you might expect: Top Tier Law Review, Stanford Law Review, Michigan Law Review, California Law Review, JELS, et cetera, et cetera. We're really fortunate to have both of them with us. They're going to be presenting on a paper today about algorithmic fairness, when a small change makes a big difference, algorithmic equity among similarly situated individuals. And let me hand it over to you guys to take it over.
Okay, I hope my slides are visible. Thank you, Jonathan, very much, both for the invitation and for the very kind introduction. And also, I want to thank both Jane and Jonathan for working with me on this project. I feel very privileged to benefit from their expertise on these issues. So I'm going to jump right in and tell you what this project is about. So I have here a general scenario. We have Al and Bob, and they're nearly identical in almost all the measurable attributes, but there's one, and I'll emphasize this, a small difference between them. And they're subjected to an algorithmic decision-making process, and they receive a very different output. So this is the scenario we want to focus on today, and we would want to walk through this situation and see what it might tell us both on a practical and theoretical level. So we're trying to figure out if this is a unique problem, is it an issue to look out for, and is it related to the broader notion of fairness? And I started with this hypothetical, but I'll try to weave in some real life situations throughout the discussion. So again, it's very difficult to speak to such a diverse crowd, people both with expertise in law and technology. So I'll just very general situate what we're talking about. We're talking about the rise of automated processes. They're assisting and even replacing human-driven decisions. They're unfolding in finance, in marketing, in retail, in pharmaceuticals. And you're generating cost-cutting efficiency, innovation, both in public and private spaces. So there's a lot of talk about the benefits of these tools, and they're being carried out across the board by large and experienced and responsible entities, but also we're starting to see them carried out by startups, by government entities, or private entities that have less experience and perhaps more of an appetite for risk. And that might lead to new forms of problems and issues. In some instances, these entities are interested in correlation and looking at data-driven results, less looking at causation. And this leads, as we all know, to a vast literature and public outcry and interest regarding issues of unfairness, potential bias, and also an opacity and lack of transparency. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? We'll talk about deliver introduction and some background. Define this issue of SCMBD, a small change makes a big difference. You could spell out that acronym. You could say it out in different ways, but we'll just leave it at this. We'll try to figure out why this is happening now. Is it a new issue? Is it a problematic issue? Maybe it is not a problematic issue. And once we understand that, we'll try and figure out what are the policy and real world implications of these observations. And I'll try to narrow down my talk so we could have some interesting Q&A. Now, there's a vast backdrop here, we're not going to get into it, of this notion of algorithmic fairness. And a lot of it is focusing on specific issues. And one of the, I think, the motivations to this talk and project in general is try to see some other aspects of fairness we might have not thought about. So the general literature talks about lack of statistical parity and lack of equality in error rates, errors of both forms, false positives and negatives, using biased data, and these broader notions of discrimination law. And what we're trying to do here is perhaps recognize that these are very important issues, but try and think about some other aspects. Now, this quickly leads us to the issue of transparency in algorithmic decision making. And transparency is both instrumental and fundamental. What do I mean by that? It means that having a transparent algorithm could be a value in itself that might stem from various human rights and might be important instrumentally to figure out where we have other issues, such as the biases we discussed. And to achieve both transparency on a fundamental level and to promote lack of bias, there's talk about opening the box, the so-called black box of decision-making process, and a lot of work on that. There's obviously pushback from industry saying that this might generate breaching trade secrets, undermine incentives for development, generate fears of gaming, and beyond that, other measures. So instead of looking at the insides of the process, perhaps we could look at inputs and outputs. So there's work on that. And this is actually the area which we will be looking at. Of course, there are other meta questions, such as who will be looking at the differences between the inputs and the outputs of the algorithm. Is this done ex post or ex ante? Will you have some form of a certification process? So for those of you that are not in this world of algorithmic decision making, I think this generally puts us within the realm of what we will try and discuss. Okay, now, what we're trying to think about now is this dynamic of small changes that make a big difference. And we find them interesting. First of all, intuitively, I think many people, from the general example I posted in the beginning, through other examples we'll throw out there here, will feel that something's wrong here. Maybe it's fair and unfairness, maybe it's something else, maybe it's an error, maybe an efficiency. I think starting out with this intuition is always important. Also, I think this is a relatively, I don't know, I wrote easy, but maybe a feasible thing to single out if we have a proper methodology, and we'll see that is a challenge here. And another point which I found interesting, and we'll get back to that towards the end of the talk, is that when you talk to data scientists, they are well aware of the potential for the small change makes a big difference phenomena, and they're trying to correct it already. And if they're trying to do so, is that prudent of them to do so, or maybe we need to supervise their self-correction of this problem? Okay, now, as we'll explain also in a moment, and maybe in the Q&A, some of us could get into this with greater detail. Having more of this dynamic of small changes make a big difference is a direct result of some forms of machine learning models. And that is why also I think this issue is one of interest today. So as I said, this is a problem. It can't explain all the problems we have, but I think that because it is to some extent overlooked for various reasons, it's something that certainly we should be thinking about. Now, as a legal scholar, I think it's also interesting to think about how this issue is similar to one that's very, let's say, dominant or generating some thought in the legal realm, which that is the issue of cliffs or cutoffs in legal decisions, right? So you could have two people that acted very similarly, and the outcomes of their actions in the legal world will be very different because the law has put in place a sharp cutoff. Two people may be driving, and one was just a little bit less careful than the other, but past this barrier of negligence, one will have to pay. One might even have to go to prison and will be fined criminally liable. And the other would not, because there is a bright line between different legal categories. Now, this is an interesting topic. It's different than, separate from the notion of norms versus standards. We could get into that a bit later, but this notion that the world, the legal world, the regulatory world has cutoffs is one that brings to life this notion of small changes that make a big difference, that take you beyond a threshold. Now, legal scholarship has explained that we're moving a bit away from this dynamic because the law is introducing some measures to smoothen out outcomes. So you could have negligence, but because you have a notion of contributory negligence, so two people might be similar, and then the law will lead to similar outcomes because of various legal tools that we are now able to introduce because law, courts, justices, and other entities are able to analyze more data and do so in a more agile fashion. Now, what we want to show is that law inevitably has these cutoff dynamics, and some categories you can't smoothen off, right? Because as Leo Katz writes, one notion we can't work around is death. You're either alive or dead, right? So there's no way to smoothen that. There's going to be a cutoff in law between life and death, and among other categories. So we can't work around that, but we think that this notion of cutoffs is having a comeback through the world of algorithmic decision making, among others, and this has some overlooked implications. Now, a few more examples if you feel alienated by this notion of the cutoffs in law. So you have cutoffs set by a law that decides what is negligent and what is not. There could be cutoffs set in place by a private or semi-private entity that needs to make decisions. For instance, we will accept students with an LSAT. So we're lawyers, this is what we think about. An LSAT over a specific threshold, or it could be a mix of both. It could be a bank that relies on a cutoff that is generated through a dynamic coming from a public entity. For instance, banks, that they look at credit scores that are generated by a private entity through a private dynamic, but the signal as to which threshold of credit score you will use comes from Fannie Mae, which also is a semi-public entity. Overall, we see cutoffs everywhere in a legal world, and This generates issues that we see intensifying unintendedly in the world of algorithms. Okay, I think I will skip this slide. Now, before we could try and figure out what we think about this notion of small changes making a big difference, let's try and get into some definitions, but what I mean by a small change and a big difference. And while doing so, we'll talk about some examples to bring this to life. Okay, so we're talking about two individuals, and they are very similar. But there's a small difference between them, a small change. So it could be the same person and he goes through a change. It could be two different people and there's a difference between them. How do we articulate this difference? So we could say we articulate the difference by looking at a continuous variable, or it could be a binary variable. And of course, deciding if a variable itself is continuous or binary is a policy decision. But what is a continuous variable that would be the input, talking about the change? It could be a personal measurement, how tall we are, how much we weigh, a numerical result of a test, how much we got in an SAT or intelligence score, or physical test. It could be historical facts about years of education or other measurements, how many days we were sick during a year. So we're already getting an understanding of how we're looking at two people and they're the same in all the elements. And this small difference in the grade they got in how many days they were sick of years of education is the input. And the output is something that leads to a very big difference between them. Okay, now, those of you ahead of a game are already thinking, what does he mean by small? Is it a ratio? So is it 10%, right? One person makes $100,000, 10 other one makes 10% more, 110. Are we looking at distribution? And then we're looking at how many standard deviations we have here. So many challenges in figuring this out. And if we talk about bimodal or multimodal distributions, this gets even more confusing. But we think that even though this is challenging, this is still something we could work with. Now, that was only talking about continuous input variables. Let's think about a binary. What do I mean by a binary? So here are some binary changes which all of you probably will agree are not a small change. One individual is like the other, just one difference. One smokes and the other does not. One goes on scuba diving during a specific vacation and the other does not. These differences are not small because we all know that they lead to substantial impacts in decisions and we're willing to accept that. Okay, but on the other hand, some of you might have read that there are companies that look at our emails, look at our communications, and if they see us using all caps, they provide one person with less favorable rates, for instance, in interest or in loans. Many of you would push back on that and say that's a small difference. So how can we decide that smoking is not small, but all caps is small? Before I respond, look at this. One person uses an iPhone, the other uses an Android. One person uses a Mac, the other uses a PC. There is literature, both on the practical level, academic level, indicating that these measures are used to feed people different outputs. What are our thoughts on that? Is that different? Is that similar? So what we're saying here, and again, it's all the context. Is it the context of credit? Is it the context of providing people with deals in advertisements or marketing? And of course, I'll leave you with this question. What about the famous purchasing of furniture pads, right? Two people are the same, but one person purchases furniture pads, and there's anecdotal evidence or stories that people were treated differently when they purchased these furniture pads. Is that a small difference? Now, in our article, and we're not going to get into it now, we're thinking about either using a normative test to establish what is small and what is not, or some technical definitions to approach this. But above all, our sense is that this is something we might be able to achieve. Now, I'm not going to get into all of this slide, but I just want to indicate that when you delve in even deeper and try to figure out what is a small change, there are many other problematic questions. For instance, what do we do if it's not one small change, but an individual that has many tiny changes as opposed to another? What happens if there are several changes over time? But once we start developing a model, I hope we will be able to overcome these issues. I've been talking for a while. Jane, do you want to say something or?
Well, just that so we're aware that the definitional problems are likely to import some policy decisions, especially when it comes to binary, the binary ones. The other thing is, I guess, with the smoking example that Tal gave, we co-authors are not. We might disagree a little bit. There may be some outputs for which even something like smoking would be considered small. And so this may be highly context dependent. So we just, for the audience's sake, we understand that there's gray area. There might be a lot of gray area. You might think there's too much gray area, but we think that there are some clear examples that help us elucidate whether this is a problem, and if so, how to treat it. Jonathan, I saw you popped up. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on Jane's point and make one other. So the normative direction that we've discussed, and I would certainly value input on, is that maybe whether something is a small change or not is something to evaluate with respect to the decision-making context, right? So rather than a quantitative measure, it's something, something more grounded in sort of law or policy or some other values, right? So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second is just I felt compelled to note that one of the amusing dimensions of this project is the authors who are a little more on the law side, I feel like have had a tendency to look for more quantitative measures of what's a small change. And as the author who's a little more on the technical side, I feel like I keep getting dragged more towards the normative dimensions of what's a small change. Make of that what you will.
Right, so I think I'm taking understanding Jonathan's hint that let's try to get out of the definitions and move into the more normative issues here. I just want to give you a flavor of the same issues come up when trying to figure out what is a big difference. We need to decide when thinking at continuous factors, a difference in a credit score, a difference in insurance premium, or a binary outcome. This is something that Jonathan's working on. If we give people parole or no parole, credit or no credit. So a final element I want to mention on this definition part is rather than figuring out what is a small change and a big difference, we might be able to just look at the imbalance between inputs and outputs. This would be much easier with continuous attributes, and we could use several mathematical tools. For me, that I'm not well educated in the realm of mathematics, I picked the odds ratio, which is easy for me to understand, that we look at the ratio between the inputs and the ratio between the outputs, and we define a certain parameter. And if it goes under this parameter, so we understand that this is something that we would flag as suspicious. That some people have already noted the odds ratio as a tool to figure out what fairness is. We're flagging this. We think it requires some more thought, but we're not married to the odds ratio. There are other elements we could use as well. Here's one example out of many that we found. So I don't know how this, I really wanted to make this slide better, but this is what I came up with. So the FTC had an investigation into a credit card company that used various parameters in setting the credit rates. This is a prime credit subprime credit card. Look here on the right, what they used. Whoever one used marriage counseling, personal counselors, went to bars and nightclubs, retreating of tires, went to pool and billiard establishments, pawn shops, and massage parlors. Now, I'm not going to take a poll here, even though I could using Zoom. How many of you would think which of these elements is small and which is not? Even among us authors, we had disagreement. But what I found interesting is that the FTC jumped ahead and regulated it, but it didn't have any authority to say this is a small change that led to a big difference. It went to the notions of disclosure that was insufficient. But my sense is that the good people at this FTC, I'm not saying this cynically, picked up at the problematic intuition that this is something that's wrong. There's a small change here that leads to a big difference in the credit card ratings, and they wanted to move into action using the limited tools that they had. Okay, now, why do we think more of this is happening now? I'm just going to say this very quickly, that to some extent, this dynamic is an unescapable aspect of algorithmic decision making, because many machine learning tools predefine various bins and place individuals within them. And when you have more and more of these bins, you have more and more of these cutoff points where you move from one group to another along this cliff, where there's one parameter that changes slightly and leads to a substantial output on the other end. So we could, I guess, engage in this more in the Q&A, but we have a sense that various technological algorithmic measures are leading to a rise in this problem. Now, some of you more legal-minded thinkers would say, okay, what's the big deal here? We have cutoffs in law all the time. Some scholars refer to this as the fact that you have lumpy laws, various cutoffs in various aspects. So what's the big deal here? Why do you think that this is a problem? And if you have an algorithmic law, so, okay, we're just, magnifying perhaps an existing dynamic that we're living with. I don't even want to say problem. So one response would say that in the law, when we have cutoffs, there's transparency about where the cutoff point is. But many of you probably have thought about algorithmic decision making, but have not thought about the fact that you have many more of these cutoffs because of the lack of transparency in generating the algorithmic decision-making process. So there's lack of transparency. We are, to use a quote from a scholar writing about this, drawing lines in the dark. The lines are unpredictable. And there's also a problem of due process. We are not part of the process of where the line is being drawn, and therefore this dynamic and its problems are exacerbated. Now, let's talk for a few minutes about why these dynamics might be problematic, maybe trying to understand the intuition that we had. And we'll talk about arbitrariness, unfairness, illegal proxy for gender or race, and the issue of gameability. The last two issues you probably will just briefly note. One point we want to start out with is, to some extent, we could say that if we note this small change makes a big difference dynamic, it might indicate a problem in the process. The process might be inefficient. It might be a spurious correlation. It might be a result of overfitting. Now, if we want to look at it a bit differently, we might say it's not only an issue of inefficiency, it's also an issue of illegality, of unfairness, because substantial due process will require that the process will be one that is proportionate between inputs and outputs. And when a process does not meet that threshold, then we would say that this process in itself is violating due process, is arbitrary, and therefore should not be used. Okay, so that's one way to look at small change makes a big difference, problematic because it is arbitrary, and that would lead to also some sets of responses. Okay, now let's look from a somewhat different perspective, and those of you not in the realm of philosophy and law, the difference might be trivial, but I don't think it is. We might say that when two people that they're almost the same, but there's a small difference between them and the outcome is very different, that's not an issue that it's arbitrary. It might not be arbitrary. It might be grounded in proper theory and findings, but it is violating norms of fairness because it is not equitable. And here we even go back to this notion coming from Aristotle that if indeed you need to engage in proportional equality, if two people are almost similar in every way, they must be treated almost similarly on the outputs. So I found this very interesting that to resolve a new issue of the 21st century, we have to go back all the way in time to Aristotle and look at how he was thinking about this issue. And not many other philosophers even articulated the Oz ratio and had this notion that people should be treated in linear fashion. If they're contributing or acting similarly, they should be treated similarly as well. Now, there's another, I'll quickly note this. There's another wrinkle here. We could talk about it also from the aspects of desert. There's a notion that if two people work the same, the outcome should be the same because they should be compensated for their work. So if one person works a bit more, according to this Lockean notion, he should proportionately receive a little bit more, all coming from this Lockean notion of desert, getting something for your work. So if we see a small change makes a big difference dynamic in some situations, it would violate this desert. If we see two people working the same, one person works 10% more, but receives twice as much in compensation, this might be a violation of this desert notion. Okay, now quickly our move forward on this point because I think this is very intuitive to many. That when we will see two people that they're very much the same, but there's a very small difference between them, many instances might be that this small difference between them isn't small at all. It's small on its face, right? But it's an indicator of a difference that relates to a illegal factor. It might be an indicator of race. It might be an indicator of gender. And thus, when you see a small change makes big difference, that's the smoke indicating the fire of the illegal discrimination notion. So perhaps small change makes a big difference is just another way for us to pick up on all the ills of discrimination that we're used to talking about. And indeed, we see some practices such as the Equal Protection Authority in the United States. They look at salaries and differences in salaries and compare them to differences in experience. And when they see indiscrepancies, when they see a dynamic that is not linear, they raise a red flag and say, something stinks here. There's something smells from discrimination, either gender or race-based. Okay, I'm going to skip this gaming aspect in the interest of time.
Hey, Tal, can I give
Jay,
another
yes.
example? So another example that's sort of well known is zip code, is that, you know, being on one side or the other of a zip code line might seem small, but maybe importing a lot of information with respect to the actual racial makeup of that zip code.
Right. So I mean, that's why it could sometimes be even silly, right? We're the same. We just have one difference in the zip code or 1 kilometer or mile in the distance between where we live and place of work. But that all is a facade for a much more serious discriminatory point. Now, one of, I think, the innovative points of of this talk would be that sometimes intuitions are wrong. And sometimes the fact that you think that small change makes big difference is problematic is an illusion. So actually, if you go online and put in the words small change makes a big difference, what you often find are articles of self-help articles, how you could change the furniture around in your house. You just add some salt or some sugar into a recipe, and something that was terrible becomes something delightful. Okay, so we have this in folklore that sometimes you make a small change and there is a big difference, and there's nothing suspicious about that. Now, beyond folklore, we could talk about actually hard science, right? So in hard science, in physics, in chemistry, there are dynamics in the world in which there are small changes and they lead to big differences, like phase transition is like the easiest to articulate. And that's just how the world is. The notion of network effects also is one point at which a small change in inputs will lead to a very big difference at that specific point. And network effects is something that describes economic processes, sociology, issues in ecology and zoology, exact sciences, and explains the behavior of humans, both on a biological level and social level. So what is the key point here? Perhaps much of what we talked about is an illusion, so as humans, I would argue, I read very few studies about it, but one could argue anecdotally that we're used to looking at the world as linear. And when something is not linear, we would think it is unfair. But many things in life are not linear. They grow in different ways. I mean, I don't want to start talking about COVID. I don't want to depress people, but also the way that COVID is distributed isn't linear as well. So if we will look at data and we will see a small change makes a big difference dynamic, it might not be an indication of an arbitrary or error prone or illegal process, but will be a reflection of what reality really is. And of course, it might be a reflection of what reality really is because the way we created reality, right? If we in a regulatory state set up cutoff points, you start paying taxes at a specific payment, you become suspect to specific investigations at a certain amount that you deposit in your bank account. If you make a certain amount of money, you come under a specific tax regime. All these points will lead to the fact that if you make a small change, that will lead to a big difference in life. Okay, so all these reasons actually lead to the fact that in many instances, you will expect to find a small change makes a big difference. And perhaps if you will correct an algorithm that reaches that outcome, you will not only commit error, but perhaps be introducing noise and bias into the system as well. Now, I just want to make a point here that I made in the end. The fact that the world might be generating small changes that make big differences doesn't solve all the problems I spoke about, because if we think that normatively proportional equality is an important ideal, so if we see the world developing in a small change makes a big difference dynamic, we would want to correct it and stop it. And the fact that this is a reflection of the world would not be a sufficient response. Okay, so I hope at this point I convinced you that this is an interesting question. And as my co-authors emphasized, and I didn't emphasize enough, context is key. I should have said that before. And what we're saying here, I believe, is to some extent novel, but it blends into a lot of writing looking at outcome-based algorithmic auditing, looking at counterfactuals, exploring alternative endings. But still, what we're doing here provides an additional level of innovation because we're offering both a methodology and a theoretical foundation under it to explain what form of outcome would we find to be problematic. Okay, so very quickly as we conclude, I want to say, what are we going to do with this? Okay. So we're not there yet, but obviously in some contexts, we could say that if we see a small change makes a big difference dynamic, we should set up a system that flags it and prohibit it. Or perhaps we should smooth it off. Perhaps we should in advance test the data we have to see if a small change makes a big difference dynamic unfolds. Maybe we should require firms to engage in these stress tests that examine if this outcome unfolds in various points, or perhaps we should do nothing. And upon concluding, because I really want to save time for our Q&A, I want to flag this last point, which might be overcorrection. So I hope that some of you are listening to this talk and you're bursting your seats and you want to say, hey, you're not really telling me anything I don't know. This is my day job. I look for these dynamics and I correct them. And I spoke to several leading data scientists and they said, yeah, we know about this. We know that this is a result of some machine learning dynamics, and using these tools is more art than science. We go in, we identify these instances, and we correct them. And what's interesting is that I'm quite sure that the management and the legal departments of these firms are not aware of these correction mechanisms, because these scientists probably assume that the world is not one where we should see these small change makes big difference dynamics, although we have plenty of reasons to believe the world should reflect them because of laws put in place, because of cutoffs, and because of natural phenomena. So perhaps when firms are doing so, they are injecting noise and perhaps creating biases of their own. And I would even say they might lead to inequality, because they might be placing an individual who was supposed to be in one bin in the other because of an assumed problem with a small change makes a big difference outcome. So I think I'll stop at this point because I want to hear from you. There's still more slides, but I'm going to turn it over to Jane and Jonathan, who might want to add before we go forth.
Yeah, I would like to make just two quick comments before pushing to Q&A, or to Jonathan's comments as well. So first of all, I do think that even among co-authors, we sometimes have different intuitions. So the example with the furniture pads, I strongly think that that's an example where it's a small change that makes a big difference, but we should not correct for that, because intuitively, once it's revealed, it makes sense. These people, it's a small purchase, but it shows a rather elaborate and important difference in the care that a person takes about protecting their things and thinking and anticipating risk and whatnot. So I just I think that highlights why correcting automatically is not necessarily the right way to go. The other thing is, I just want to point out the three ways in which the small change makes a big difference interacts with law. And Tal actually has developed this beyond where we co-authors all left it. And so I really applaud him for that. So first of all, law affects the inputs, so that there are there may be some inputs that wind up being big when in fact they're small, and vice versa. Maybe more importantly, though, this can help us view the law as itself an algorithm that has a SCMBD problem, right? Where there are times where very small differences between people lead to dramatically different treatment under the law. And so if we can use, this might be an instance where learning how to even self-regulate or embed ethics into AI and machine learning could actually inform how we should design law as well. And that reverse, the reversal of the usual order of the way that the insights move is really cool, I think. And then finally, law is there as somewhat of a restriction. Tal mentioned the idea of substantive due process, where you cannot, at least if it's a government actor, you can't have this arbitrary treatment. And then there are certain types of, you know, anti-discrimination laws and whatnot that import the same concepts. So, so law is sort of embedded in this in multiple ways, and I just wanted to highlight that. Jonathan?
Yeah, let me quickly make 2 points, and then we have our first question from Mahir. So the both points are keying off of how law thinks about small changes. The point Jane closed on. So I just wanted to draw another area of doctrine that has this same type of consideration, which is the fundamental rights branch of the Equal Protection Clause. Tal had a note on it on one of the slides. And I think there is some parallel to consider, at least for the constitutional law nerds in the audience, in the way the law thinks about fine distinctions in areas where some important interest is at stake, right? So burdens on voting, for example, right? The law is going to require extra justification for finicky line drawing by state actors. And you could reframe that as finicky line drawing is a small change and voting is super important. That's a big difference. So there's an area where there's a real parallel. The other point I just wanted to make is that I think we have on record, is this maybe the first time legal academics have said computer scientists have like taken technology and like helped us figure out how the legal system works. I feel like we should like memorialize this moment. At any rate, this is one of the things I've loved most about this project. Tal and Jane are not just tremendous legal scholars, but they're some of the legal scholars who are most willing to engage deeply with technical substance. And so I really appreciate that. Okay, so let's get to the Q&A. Mahir, if you're able to jump in, I'll let you ask the question yourself. And if not, I've got your question in text, and so I can read it. All right, so Mahir says he can't jump in, so let me read it for him. He asks, can you talk more about how a Rawls-informed view of justice would analyze what counts as a small change that should be discounted behind the veil of ignorance, and what is a change that we should be concerned about?
My first reaction and hunch is that it might not be too different from how Aristotle would think about it too, is that we all ex ante want to be treated fairly. You know, notions of desert and just equal treatment for its own sake, I think are the sorts of values that are preserved by putting us behind the veil of ignorance. And I'm not, so if there's something more though that a Rawlsian analysis can get us, I'd love to hear from Mahir and Tal and Jonathan, if you have other thoughts, please add.
Right, so I'm not sure that the Rawlsian analysis helps us with the deltas, which is what this project is about, right? It's about you know, the disparities between the differences in the inputs and in the outputs, that at some point they become unacceptable. And what is that point? So I'm not sure that the Rawlsian analysis provides an answer to that. But that's the extent I would know. But Jonathan, I see that Mahir wrote some more here. I don't know.
He did. Let me suggest this. Why don't we go through the queue, and then we can circle back to Mahir.
Okay.
On the next part of his questions. Okay. Next up, Shannon, if you're able to jump in again, you know, be able to ask yourself. But if we have if we're not able to do that, I'll read for you. Okay. Oh, here we go.
Oh, I'm suddenly unmuted. So my question is, if we're already making ethical and legal judgments about which small changes effects are of concern to us. So we said maybe the mattress one we don't care to intervene, and other ones we do. What are the additional advantages when we try and use quantifiable measures to profile the proportionality? Do we get something extra out of like trying to do it numerically, as opposed to what Jonathan was saying, that maybe he'd tend more towards the legal analysis side rather than a mathematical model side?
So hi, Shannon, how are you doing? On the other side of the world, I meet you. Listen, I'll tell you, this is very interesting because for me as a legal scholar, and this came up with a lot of discussion with Jonathan, there's a magic of perhaps articulating these differences in a formula and not having to come up with, an answer of, is smoking different than buying a furniture pad, which I think is almost impossible to answer beyond just a normative response. But when I thought of, 10% is acceptable, but 20 is not. So that gives me an ability to deal with, or, one standard deviation is acceptable, 2 or not. That allows me to deal with this problem of why is one person just working 10% more, but making twice as much? So that for me is the draw of using these continuous variables and maybe even articulating the binary ones in a continuous fashion. And in that way, responding to this very difficult normative answer. But I know Jane and Jonathan have been thinking about some technical measures also to respond to the problems of the binaries. So maybe that would not be required.
Well, I think I've always thought of the quantitative approach as useful procedurally rather than answering the ultimate question. Is that if we don't use a mechanical and therefore quantifiable measure, then it means that I'm not quite sure how to catch potential instances of this otherwise. You could have a bunch of you could have the legal team kind of looking through the inputs, so it seems to me that this would be very useful for flagging a possible small change makes a big difference candidate, and then having the normative discussion among the legal ethics team or whatnot, or among law policymakers. So I thought that was one of the advantages of trying to do a not perfect, but not too much type 1 error sort of approach to this.
I agree with that, and I would add that in addition to sort of a quantitative analysis being an input to this type of evaluation of an algorithmic decision-making system, there's the output side too. Right? Like, let's suppose you decide you have, as a matter of values or law or policy, whatever your normative basis, you think a certain type of change shouldn't lead to certain types of differences. Ultimately, you have to encode that somehow. And if you want to actually implement it in an algorithmic decision-making system, you're going to have to quantify it. And so on the sort of output side too, once you've made a decision about whether something constitutes what at various points has been called a scumbag.
Jonathan said it first.
I know, yeah. There's clearly like the look among all the authors who's going to say it first. Anyway, the output side is a possible place for quantitative numbers, quantitative analysis to come into. Okay, let's move on to the. Shannon, you unmuted yourself. Are you unsatisfied with what you've heard?
No, that was just a thank you.
Very good, very good. Okay, so next up we have our fearless leader, Matt Solganic. Matt, as with Shannon, if you're able to jump in, that'd be great. And if not, we can read.
Hi. I'd like to ask, well, first, thank you. I think the small change makes a big difference is a very interesting idea. And I think it really hinges on how we define small and large. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. In particular, you mentioned that you thought context might be key. but I'd like to understand better how you think context would be key, and if that can happen in a way that's kind of more automatable in the way that you're interested in. And just as a background for my question, I'm a little bit skeptical that it's possible from the literature on causal inference and observational data, which requires researchers to say that two people, to put a number on the distance between two people. And a lot of work in that literature has come up with the idea it's kind of hard to do this in general. It has to be done in a context specific way.
Yeah, so again, I don't think that the definition has to be perfect to add value. So if there's a definition that can then get us to the point where we then ask the context question, then that I think is still contributing something. Personally, you know, in the terms of how to do it, I prefer mechanisms that are very sensitive to distributions, because I think that makes more sense. So if you're talking about two, you know, if you have a normal distribution and there are two people that are actually pretty close to the mean, that to me seems like a good candidate for small, because it's not just small in it won't just be small in absolute terms. It will be small even in terms of the how closely clustered those people are. Whereas if you're talking about a difference between someone who's, you know, in the kind of nice part of the lump of one of the modes, and then someone else who's a small distance away, but actually there aren't very many other people that are similarly situated, that to me naturally suggests that is not a small, it looks small, but it's deceiving. It's actually not very small. So but again, even if we all agreed on the technical definitions of small and large, which is hard, and to some extent we're putting a little bit of a pin in it and just saying, let's assume there's some core where we can all agree. Let's ask the next set of questions of whether it's bad. But I think that even if the definition isn't precise enough, or even if we don't all agree on it, it could then lead us to the next question of, you know, should these people be, the should question, the normative question, should these people be treated differently?
If I could say something, first of all, in terms of context, so obviously some contexts will call for higher scrutiny and more care. If we're talking about parole, right? So I think we would be much more suspicious than figuring out other instances where the outcome is less dire. So I think that will be one place to look at context. And if it's okay to post a question to the audience, how many of you, if people just want to vote or note, how many of you think this is a project of about a non-existing problem? Because how many of you think, I have never heard of this small change make big difference phenomenon, dynamic. I never saw it in practice. I never saw it in the literature. And these are just legal scholars making up a problem they could write a smart answer about. So I'm very curious the thoughts to people of that. You don't need to respond. If you just want to write to me or like respond in the box here, I'm very curious about that.
All right. On that note, with Tal inviting feedback by email, which we all welcome, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much, Tal and Jane, for joining us. I'm really excited about this project and to get to work with you both on it. And thanks for making the time to join us.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see you, and stay safe and healthy.